We're having this meeting today in the Colorado State Capitol because there are definite political and policy questions that are raised by this. And politics is the realm in which the decisions get made about what we will be doing, certainly on a governmental level, in coming years. Ethics, my area of interest, gives us a coherent basis and a language and a framework for making those decisions in the political realm or in our society. It gives us the understanding, the norms, the discussion of the values that we might use to understand how to make those decisions, why to make those decisions, why to care. Heard a conversation earlier today talking about the importance of peer-reviewed studies in science. Ethics is sort of the realm in which we can do peer review work on our values and our belief systems. It's a way in which we can have a conversation where they talk back and forth about that. As it said, I am an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. I want to make clear that this is not a doctrinal discussion today, that there's a difference between ethics and religion. Ethics can be, but does not have to be, grounded in religious beliefs. Certainly, ethics is something that people in religious communities pay a lot of attention to, but other people do too. The ethical norms that we talk about provide a language and a framework that can span religious and secular conversations. And as one very good example of that, some of you may have heard about a marvelous document called the Earth Charter that grew out of the United Nations, has an independent life, that is an absolutely splendid, very brief discussion of ethical norms and proposed bases of action for dealing with the range of environmental and social justice issues around the world. And that happens in a community of conversation that connects with religion but also stands beside that. Ethics is a respected field in philosophy. There is a subsection of that academic field called environmental ethics that's a lively conversation and certainly deals with a lot of stuff beyond climate change. Climate change is one piece of the field of environmental ethics, and a lot of what I'll be talking about today is hooking those larger and smaller circles. And so my comments today will fit well with religious beliefs, but they don't depend on them. So my goal for today is to look at that language and framework section. What are the things that we can talk about? How do we talk about it? I am not going to try and provide ethical answers to all of the controversial issues. So that's the question and answer time. One of the core ethical questions that comes up in many circles is, who is my neighbor? Many variations on that, but we're all asking, who's the one that I need to be concerned about? It occurs to me as I've looked at that question over again that many times when people are asking that question, what they're really asking is, who is not my neighbor? Who are the ones that I don't have to be concerned about? What are the boundaries for the circle of my ethical concern? And good ethics will almost always stretch those boundaries out farther than we feel comfortable with. In ethical language, neighbor is not terribly precise, so the ethicists talk about a moral subject. Subject is a person who has moral standing, who is in relationship, who is an object of decision and action and initiative and moral concern and relationship. One who is not a subject, one who is not our neighbor, is considered an object, a thing, something that has no moral standing, that we are not obligated to deal with in terms of just and fair relationships. When we use our ethics to stretch out those boundaries of neighbor, I think we can look at three ways in which we do that most significantly these days. The first one is the realization that all people all around the world are very much our neighbors, especially in terms of climate relationships. In the last couple of sessions, we've heard things with a focus on what's going on in Colorado, but it's very clear that climate change issues reach all the way around the world. If we think of the Inuit in the Arctic and the disappearance of their way of life, the melting of tundra, the thawing of ice, the carbon that we're releasing here directly impacts people and changes their way of life. Our behaviors impact moral subjects in a different part of the world. The people in Bangladesh, whose homeland is going underwater from rising seas and disrupted water tables, are moral subjects whose lives are being changed by our behavior. The people in Tuvalu, whose country is going underwater, are being impacted by us. Those people are our neighbors. We have relationships with them, and we are impacted by them. In the same way, we are impacted by those moral subjects in China, whose increased carbon emissions are changing our lives. We are in moral and interdependent relationships. It's also clear as we think, especially about climate and the very rapid changes that are happening in our world, that people of future generations are also our neighbors. That the things that we are doing now are changing the world to come in unprecedented ways. In my conversations with church people, this often comes up in the question about, well, what sort of world do I want to leave to my children and grandchildren? We realize that what we're doing now will make a difference in how they live their lives. But in terms of morality and ethics, that's the wrong question to ask. Because when we say, what sort of world do I want to leave, it makes it a matter of my charity and a matter of my choices about what I want to give to them. Ethically, it's more significant to say, what sort of world do my children and grandchildren have a right to demand and expect from us? What obligations do we have to meet their needs? That's a very different moral question. And the third stretch, which is less universal in the moral conversations and ethical conversations, stretches beyond the human realm and says that the rest of creation, other species, natural systems, are also our neighbors. That what we are doing now is having enormous impacts on the life of the world, on the biosystems and the ecology of our planet. And so if we think about other species as being moral agents, as being in ethical relationships with us, those things that we are doing also have ethical categories. When we're dealing with ethical subjects, when we're dealing with our neighbors, then we have to take seriously the fact of our relationship with those others beyond ourselves and the mutual impacts that we have with those that we recognize as our neighbor. And our ethical actions, if we are going to call ourselves ethical, have to deal respectfully and responsibly with all of those people in our expanded moral universe. It puts an obligation on us. It makes it harder for us, which may be why lots of people don't want to think about the ethical part. Once we've expanded those circles of neighbor, the ethicists have defined 4 norms, 4 standards that are very helpful in understanding how we relate well. And these 4 norms have become widely recognized as valuable for discussing things in the realm of what's called eco-justice, the intersection between ecological and human justice issues. And we'll run through these briefly and we'll loop back to some of them. There's solidarity, sustainability, sufficiency, and participation. Solidarity reminds us that we are in that relationship with all of those other neighbors and with the systems of the world. And the intriguing thing is, in the terms of ethics, that it does not demand that we be marvelous, good-hearted, charitable people who are willing to give up all of our own self-interest in doing the right thing for others. Solidarity is enlightened self-interest. It calls on us to do the right thing for others because it also has a payback for us. So when we think about the impacts of climate change, we realize that that will have destabilizing effects on the world around us. If there are billions of climate refugees fleeing rising seas, drought, whatever they're fleeing, that's going to cause enormous political turmoil around the world, economic disruptions. It is to our advantage to make sure that those sorts of things don't have to come about. If coral reefs collapse because of warming and more acidic oceans, that disrupts the breeding ground for a huge percentage of marine life, and that's going to be devastating for human society. It's in our own self-interest to care well for the reefs, for the people around the world. We're all in it together. We are part of an interconnected world, and the norm of solidarity reminds us that it's to our advantage to care for others. We can't look at our narrow self-interest without recognizing our interconnection. Sustainability obviously suggests that we need to do things that are sustainable for a very long time. One of the definitions of sustainable development, which is slightly different than pure sustainability, came out of a United Nations report in 1987, the Brundtland Commission, that said sustainable development meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. We don't remove the possibilities from future generations. Now, as this is generally applied, it makes incredible assumptions about the creativity of those future generations. That, well, they will come up with other energy sources so we can use all the oil and coal. They will find ways of stabilizing climate so we can keep doing what we're doing. If we take that charge seriously, to not compromise the possibilities of future generations, it really is fairly constraining on us right now. As we think about some of the issues of sustainability, we've heard talk about water issues in great detail. And if we are disrupting water supplies, whether by overpumping aquifers that cannot be replenished with the current disruptions in climate from melting glaciers, whatever, then that is impacting the possibility of future generations to have the sort of water agricultural biological setting that we have now. One of these commonly found diagrams talks about sustainability as the overlap between economy, society, and environment. The size of those needs to be adjusted. The fact that the economy is the same size as the environment is pretty disruptive. But we could certainly have a sustainable environment if we removed all the people. If we just took off 2 of those circles, the environment would be far more stable fairly quickly than it is now. That's generally not considered an ethical response. Some do. So the point of sustainability is to look at the area of overlap where the concerns of all 3 of those areas are met, which, again, limits our options. There are economic things you can do outside of sustainability that are constrained if we look at the ethical norm of being sustainable into the long-term future. A third norm is sufficiency, which is a term that we don't hear quite as frequently. It basically means enough. Sufficient cause, sufficient resources, gives us enough, being able to meet the basic needs for survival of food and shelter, clothing, healthcare, perhaps education. The ethical norms say that sufficiency is one of those bedrock values, that people having enough to get by on is a basic requirement. And so we get the United Nations Millennium Development Goals that look at increasing sufficiency by 2015 and reducing global poverty and reducing global starvation levels. There's about 1 billion people in the world today who are living on $1 a day or less. That's really not sufficient. And so the goal of sufficiency says that we have to pay close attention to those who have the least. Ethics gives a priority of sufficiency to those who have the greatest need. It does not look at the ethical importance of increasing affluence. And so the diagram there from Alternatives for Simple Living, showing the poor of the world with nothing and the northern societies sitting on all the wealth. When we look at what's being talked about in terms of strategies for addressing climate change, there's often an emphasis on maintaining the wealth of the rich. And the ethical considerations make us look very hard at who is given the priority and who is given the importance in that. And the fourth norm is participation, that all stakeholders should have a say in decisions where their outcomes are involved. The rallying cry of the American Revolution was no taxation without representation. I guess there's a corresponding one for these days of no environmental devastation without representation. That people should have a say in what's happening to their lives and their habitats and their world. And so that's fairly clear, not well done, but fairly clear in terms of our global human community. when you get into the future generations and other species, it means that we have to very intentionally and responsibly provide others to give voice to those who cannot speak for themselves at this time. This picture from the UN negotiations in Copenhagen a year ago remind us of some of the venues in which that participation goes on. United Nations is the best setting we have for international agreements, but these street protests remind us that there are many groups and agencies who stand outside of the national governments, indigenous peoples, non-governmental organizations, some business interests, local communities, and the charge of participation says that all of them need to be able to participate in some way in the decision-making about what goes on. Obviously, these are not simple things to work out, but the goals are very important. So we connect our expanded notion of neighbors, of ethical norms, and of climate change. And when we put all of those together, we see that we have a very complicated problem, and that good ethics will interconnect all of those. That when we talk about sustainability, we will do that not just for our local community, but with the sense of global neighbors and future generations and all species. Those all overlap and intermingle with each other. Climate change is often described, certainly in religious circles, as a matter of global justice. And that can be a very touchy-feely term if it's left undefined, that we are simply concerned about justice and fairness for the world. What these ethical norms allow us to do is to provide specific details about that. We are able to understand why this is a matter of justice when we apply those global norms. If there is injustice going on, it's because one or more of those ethical norms are being violated for one or more of those extended communities of ethical subjects. Most specifically, as it's talked about in ethical circles, the heaviest impacts of climate change are generally occurring in the nations and the communities that did the least to cause it. In part because they have less resources to adapt, and in part because that's just where it's hitting. The countries that have produced very little carbon dioxide are having very large impacts from the emerging issues of climate change. And so when we see that these things are hitting people who had no voice in whether or not that was appropriate and have little resources to deal with it, we see that in those extended communities of our neighbors, the norms of participation, sustainability, and sufficiency are all being violated. There's a lot of justice problems there. And we in the affluent world who are causing the problems, when we are complacent about allowing those to happen, we are violating the norm of solidarity. We are not understanding our interconnection and our responsibility with those other subjects. This gives us a little bit of a handle on understanding why there are justice issues in what's going on around the world. Another piece that connects with all of this is another ethical principle that's called the precautionary principle, that generally says, in the face of uncertainty, do what you can to keep from making things worse. Business as usual that's causing the problems is not the appropriate course if we're still debating whether or not the science is solid. Now, in my mind, we don't need to invoke the precautionary principle because there's no uncertainty. This is going on, we need to act. But even if we are in a political, social setting where those discussions are up in the air, to say that business as usual, the increased production of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases is ethically inappropriate according to the precautionary principle that says, don't do something that's going to make it worse. Now, it's interesting to note that the precautionary principle is claimed by both sides in the climate debate. People like me say we should be doing everything possible to reduce carbon emissions because that's an appropriate precautionary course. Other people say we shouldn't be unnecessarily disrupting the economy while there's still uncertainty. And it's interesting to see that argument going both sides. I think we can certainly find places where there are economically helpful things that also reduce the carbon impacts. And so what we see in Colorado with the push towards a clean energy economy says we don't have to look at all of the things about the precautionary principle on the economic side as a block to what can be done on the climate and biological side. Some other ethical factors that come to my mind as we look at climate. It's very clear that good ethics requires good information. If you're doing it all on hunches and distorted facts, then you're not going to get very far in making good ethical decisions. So we need to be very intentional about taking a look at the best science about climate change, at solid economic studies, at sociology and politics and psychology and all the factors that are involved in how our world works, and look at the best information that we can get from those sources. And when we look at the economic side of it, we need to make sure that it's a comprehensive economics, and it really does describe all of the costs, whether or not those are monetarized. You know, we need to look at the ecosystem services, at the externalities of pollution and other factors that often don't go on the spreadsheets. Good ethics demands a very comprehensive look at all of the factors involved. I'd also point out that those who would advocate for purely market-based approaches to ethics, that those market approaches usually violate the norm of participation. The people who get to participate in economic decision-makings are the ones who have economic resources. And those who do not have the resources don't get to vote. And so we are cutting off the poor of the world, the future generations, the other species, if we simply say, let the market decide. And I hope, obviously, good ethics is both a matter of personal choices and institutional actions, that ethics applies to government policy and business decisions, as well as the way we make choices in our individual lives. And that's where you can track me down if you have questions. Clearly, we are both more connected and more isolated. Those are interconnected themes, that some of the institutions that are active in the process of globalizing our world are also very active in hiding the connections from us. And so we are actively dissuaded from looking for information about where the products that we get come from and the ecological effects of those. I think we are seeing a shift towards people wanting more of the connection, the trend towards local foods, towards ecological responsibility in electronics recyclings. We're aware more of what goes on with those things, of labeling of our foods so that we know what goes into them. I think people are hungering more for an awareness of the connections that they know are there. And some of that may come from our internet-enabled world where we are able to see some of those human factors. But the powerful forces of economic globalization are in some ways far more persuasive than the psychological factors of seeking to be ethically connected. So part of the challenge is to help us find those ways of building the sense of neighbor and the sense of subject relationships instead of the sense of things that simply come from nowhere and go nowhere. Eco-Justice Ministries was the lead agency for coordinating the 350 Denver project 10 months ago. No, count up, 15 months ago. Trying to raise awareness of 350 parts per million as the highest safe level of CO2 in the atmosphere. And we helped coordinate 20-some different events in metropolitan Denver, everywhere from a rally on the west steps of this building to interfaith worship services and churches ringing their bells 350 times and local communities doing education and food programs. And we were one of the most active cities in the country in doing that. It was very exciting to be a part of that movement, both locally and in terms of connecting with what was going on all around the world that day with the passion of a grassroots movement. It was discouraging that an awful lot of the people who were involved in that were the same folk who are involved in the other things and have been long-term, and we did not bring in as many new people to the cause as I would have hoped. We didn't bring quite as much political pressure to bear on the governments of the world as I would have hoped. But I certainly see those grassroots movements as an essential part of the ethical norm of participation, of giving voice, of claiming accountability for our role in the world, and pushing our governments towards that. The 350 movement, like many of the things I've been involved with, is not political in the sense that its goal was beyond what the current political systems are capable of doing. Getting back to 350 parts per million is an overwhelming challenge, but it's also recognizing that, as Bill McKibben says, nature doesn't compromise. Yeah, our political systems might compromise, but nature is going to do what nature is going to do. And so to name the fact that 350 is perhaps the highest level where we can have the stability we've depended on is, out of my religious tradition, a prophetic witness that has to be made. Humanity has very successfully been doing geoengineering for the last 100 or 200 years, and the results are frightening. Whether or not we can intentionally do that in ways that would reverse what we've done so far certainly deserves study. The precautionary principle is something to bear in mind very strongly on that. Don't rush into geoengineering if the risks are very high on the unintended consequences. But we certainly need to look at all avenues for how we can address climate. As folks have said, there is no one single silver bullet to fix this. We're looking at silver buckshot. Do as many different things as possible, all working together in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much.